My name is Fernandez, for those of you who don't know me. I'm director of the International Policy Network here at the LSE, at PSSRU. Before I go any further, just a couple of admin points I need to go through. One is that we're not expecting to have a fire alarm, so if a fire alarm sounds, it will be a real one, and it should sound as a continuous ringing bell. And therefore we must ensure that everyone leaves the venue immediately by the nearest emergency stairway, which is to the right, and do not use, or to the left, as you can see over there, and do not use the lifts. The good news is that we've got tea at 11:45, and that's always a good thing, and lunch at 1:45. So welcome to the event. I'm going to go through very briefly a couple of words on the motivation for the event today. This is the motivation for why we wanted to set up this event. Without going into any of the detail of these figures, which Gerald Wistow is going to discuss later on in terms of highlighting the picture in England. Basically, in England, over the last 5 years, we've had an unprecedented reduction in the numbers of people supported by the state. People with long-term care needs, people with social care needs. This we haven't seen ever. There's been historically reductions in the numbers of people receiving services, but something like this we've never seen. And so we want to understand whether this picture is something that is replicated in other parts of the world, in other parts of Europe and beyond. So are the cuts having the same sort of impact on the one hand, in terms of the level of service that is being provided by the state and funded by the state? Secondly, what are the implications? So what are what does that mean for people with long-term care needs? And thirdly, how are different systems coping with those budget cuts? So to what extent are new ideas emerging about how to address the fact that there is less money in the system, or at least less money once you take into account the fact that there are more people requiring social care support year on year? So those are the sorts of questions that we wanted to address today. And we've got, I think, an excellent lineup of speakers. And particularly excellent because they come from very different systems, and it is very likely that actually the responses and the extent to which the financial crisis, very broadly speaking, the impact of the financial crisis on the social care system, on the long-term care system, will be mediated by the nature of the system. Whether it's a mixed system, whether it's a local system, whether it's an entitlement system. And we've got a large number of types of welfare systems represented today. And so I think it's going to be a really interesting experience, and really we're going to learn a lot, and perhaps come up with new ideas about how to deal with the budget cuts here in England. This morning we were going to have, I think this is a high-risk event, because we were going to have more speakers. One speaker, she broke her arm and therefore couldn't come. Yesterday we got an email, or this morning we got an email from Tim Muir from OECD, saying that he is in bed with a terrible bug that his 4-month-old has shared with him, and therefore he is unable to come. He sent us his presentation, and so I'm going to try to, the good thing about giving somebody else's presentation is that you're not to blame for anything. You don't understand yourself. It's going to be rubbish.
Especially if it's the OECD.
Sorry?
Especially if it's the OECD's 80 payments, and I could be, you don't need to take the blame.
So I will be going through some of the slides at least, and I actually had discussed with him his presentation before, so I think I know which key messages he wanted to highlight. And then we'll have my colleague Gerald Wistow, who's having a breakfast there, just to put you on the spot. Looking at the last few years of the social care system in England and what it means in terms of budget cuts. And then we will have the view from north of the border, from Scotland. Professor David Bell, who is sitting over there, who will be telling us about what's happening in Scotland. And actually, I think there are some very interesting contrasts. What we try to do is to have the presentations. If you've got points of clarification, so questions about the interpretation of what is being said, please raise those. Otherwise, it would be good if you've got more general points to leave those for the end of the session. We'll have the 3 presentations first, and then we'll have time for a broader discussion. So let me try, first of all, to transform myself into Tim. Tim is a very nice guy. So, and so, this is Tim uses OECD data, and I think, as has been already mentioned, OECD data is sometimes difficult to interpret, or has some caveats around it. But I think this is quite a telling figure. This is looking at the rate of growth. This rate of growth in health expenditure across the OECD. It's an average, and you see how that falls in 2009. This is 2009. How the pattern is really changed. Okay, so we don't know exactly what health expenditure means in different countries, but at least there's an indication that something is happening in the health and social care system, linked to some limitations in terms of levels of expenditure.
And the red line is 0?
The red line is 0 indeed. So that red line is he should have put this much bigger, of course. And enjoy the moment. Anyway, so yes, now again, this is going to be very difficult to read, but this is looking at separating rates of growth in expenditure, first of all, by countries, and secondly, between 2 periods. The gray is 2000 to 2009. The dark, the black, let's say, is 2009-11. And you see how systematically, for almost every single one of those countries, except 2 on the right, I think, which are Israel and Japan, you see that the black, so the recent trend, is significantly below the gray. Okay? Again, there will be issues about the interpretation of the data, but nevertheless, there's a clear pattern that in the last few years there's been a slowdown in the rate of growth of expenditure across the whole of the health system, and in some instances, and the UK is part of that, there's been a contraction. Okay? In this slide, Tim is trying to then break the overall pattern across types of expenditure. So here, this is long-term care, which I guess is what is key to us today, and these are different years. So this is 2007, 8, 8, 9, 9, 10, etc. And this is 2011, 12. And I think what Tim wanted to say with this is that actually, yes, there's been a cut, but perhaps there's been a change in rates in the rates of growth, but that perhaps the long-term care system, as defined by the OECD data, and that of course is important to bear in mind, but perhaps has suffered slightly less than some of the others. In particular, if you compare against, for example, pharmaceuticals or outpatient care. Okay. So Tim's view is that to some extent the long-term care system is being protected. I don't think that's, if I may say, that's the case across all countries, and we'll see some different patterns later on. This is trying to, again, look at rates of annual growth in long-term care expenditure across the European Union, looking at 3 groups of countries. You've got Western Europe and Scandinavia, which remains more or less around here, slight shift down. Eastern Europe and Portugal, Greece, and Spain. And what you see is that some of these really, really outstanding levels of growth in expenditure, up to 40% for some of the Eastern European countries, have come down significantly, and the same for some of the Southern European countries. So then Tim wanted to speculate about, so what does this mean? You know, so what about these trends? And so he sets out this, I guess, framework for trying to understand what the impact is. And he thinks, well, if there's lower spending at the very left, what is that? Is this because we've got a more efficient system that needs fewer resources in order to do the same job, which is that line at the top with an exclamation mark? And actually, some of the local authorities in England have suggested that some of what we see is linked to that. But anyway, then, or is it that we've got just a problem with the data at the bottom, inaccurate data, or do we have basically less care being handed? And if so, is that because there is less care needed at the top? Is it because we're now using different pathways, different types of care to meet the needs of those people? Or at the bottom, is this just leading to a unmet need? Is this basically leading to more people going without support? And in terms of the new care pathways, I guess he highlights two. One is individuals paying for their own care, either care going on. And the other is basically informal carers having to pick up the reduction in the levels of incentive. And then there's a set of slides that treat some of those, which I'm not going to go into any detail, which I don't think I will do them justice. But basically, you'll see that he eliminates some of those hypotheses. Little by little, he says, well, it's not about demographics. It's not necessarily about, you'll see later, disability rates. He argues that it's not really more private expenditure. And it's not necessarily that people do not have the means, there's no supply to meet the care of those needs, which is the cross at the bottom. So it's not about less care really needed at the top, he argues. But we don't know whether this is actually having an impact on informal care or the extent to which it is having an impact. And we don't know to what extent this is having an impact on unmet needs. So how many more people are going without support? So some key questions there. And he then talks about the English case, but I'm going to skip that, given that Gerald is going to talk about that in greater detail. And so, then he has some conclusions, and not surprisingly, perhaps, some of the conclusions are about, well, we need better evidence. We really don't know how to match, levels of activity to individuals, to outcomes. We don't know exactly what's happening. And I think from the English case, we would certainly support that sort of conclusion. So I'm going to leave it there. And I think, Gerald?
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, Jose Luis. He's already given you one reason why I said yes, which is that I knew the croissant would be great. So one reason I came was for my breakfast. The other is that we're looking to move house. It's the usual downsizing. Kids have gone away doing sensible things with themselves, and we're trying to decide where to go. We live within 100 miles of the Scottish border, so that's one clear option, I think, as we will discover later on. And we've got a grandson who lives in Copenhagen. And the Danish record and outcomes for older people is pretty good, actually. And then we could stay in the northeast of England with its sort of East European mortality rates and its expenditure on a pretty unbalanced mix of spending on health and social care. And because it's one of the most deprived parts of England, it's also experiencing the biggest cuts in public expenditure because it's been so dependent upon public expenditure to maintain its economic levels of activity over the past 20 years or so. So it's a bit of a no-brainer, isn't it? Anyway, I just wanted to come along today and see if my prejudices about other parts of Europe and other parts of what's still the United Kingdom of the time are in fact true before making my final decisions to where to move house. And I'm talking about public funding of adult social care. So it's the support that is provided by the taxpayer in one form or another, to social care provision for adults. Social care for children is separate. It's in England rather than other parts of the United Kingdom. And my underlying sort of question is there an underlying sort of policy rationale for the way in which spending and activity policies in England have developed over recent years? So that's what I'm hoping to address. I thought I'd better just start out by saying, given we've got an international audience, what do we mean by adult social care? A very useful definition from a review by the National Audit Office, which is the main sort of government accountant, if you like, which not only looks at the propriety of spending, but also looks at whether or not spending is being used effectively in terms of getting a match between the stated goals of government and its actual outputs. So it's personal care, practical support. The government has policies, successive governments, I'm including this new one, to use social care as part of a range of mechanisms for improving the quality of life of adults, for delaying and reducing their need for care, for ensuring positive care experiences, and safeguarding adults from harm. That's the objectives. A few key facts. First is that if you use that as the definition of social care, actually only a minority of all the activities that are provided and funded are funded through the public sector. It's that proportion is decreasing as the amount of private funding increases. Secondly, most care and support is provided unpaid through informal care. Thirdly, many adults pay for their formal care services, some or all of them, whether in the form of co-payments or full payments. Fourthly, local authorities are the main funding. They are the primary public funding source, and they provide funds on a means-tested basis for people who have limited means and high needs. And they commission most care from the private and voluntary sectors. The bulk of publicly funded social care was outsourced, in fact, during the previous Conservative government, which John Major and Margaret Thatcher led. So there's a long experience, therefore, of local authorities as commissioners and contractors and not as direct providers. They retain some critical but small-scale direct provision responsibilities. In addition to that, they do provide a range of universal and preventative services. They're being called upon to provide more, for example, information and advice services, and these are available without assessment of either need or means. But that's a very small part of the total provision. Just to put that in some figures, to tie some of that down, we spend about 19 billion pounds on social care, compares roughly 100 billion on the health service. So it's very much the junior partner of what we call health and social care. About 10% of adults in England have are limited a lot in their day-to-day activities, and about just under two-thirds of adult social care service users are satisfied or very satisfied with the care they get. That's rather less than in the NHS, despite some might question, which service does most harm? It's the responsibility of for funding and commissioning social care lies with 152 local authorities, as I've said, locally elected, funded by grants from central government. The amount they can spend is capped each year, and if they seek to raise their local taxes, which form a very small proportion of all spending, if they want to raise it above the cap that, I think it's 2% above the cap that the government has set, they have to call a local referendum in order to get the authority of their electorate to do so. So their ability to add to government funding is therefore relatively constrained. I should say add to central government funding. I think I mentioned before there are 5.4 million informal carers. There's 1.5 million people work in social care, which is actually a bit more than in the NHS, which you'll probably know is the third biggest organisation in the world. It's said to be the third biggest bureaucracy in terms of employees. That tells you something else about social care. It's a very fragmented and disaggregated service. There are a lot of people working it, but they don't work within a single service under a single brand, as in the case of the NHS. And it's not only fragmented in the sense that it's not a national service, it's fragmented between public, community, voluntary and for-profit sectors. I should also say that those people are in the main pretty poorly paid. They can generally, some people providing home care, for example, when you take into account the fact that their travel expenses may not be paid, are actually earning less than the minimum wage. And people regularly, according to the anecdotes, I don't know whether it's been proven, though Caroline may know, people regularly say that you can earn more money stacking shelves in the local supermarkets than you can providing intimate care to very vulnerable, sometimes very confused people. We think that about 10 billion is spent by self-funders. We think that you can estimate the value of informal care in several ways. The highest estimate is that it equates to about 55 billion compared with 19 billion formal funding. And of course, that's equivalent to half the amount we spend on the NHS. And now, local authorities, in the main, 87% of them, only meet the needs through their eligibility criteria of people with the highest levels of need. There's been a focusing of resources on those with higher needs by setting higher eligibility criteria. So that's some key facts about it. Another point about social care, of course, is the way we're organised in England is we don't have a long-term care system. We have a batch of separate services, and that clearly creates some of the problems of fragmentation and the need for integration that I've mentioned. Essentially, how well people do in our long-term care system depends upon how well the different parts of the services fit together. The particular issue is that good social care is both the completer of many medical health service procedures, and it's also good social care. Also, we have some people think misplaced degrees of confidence in its ability to reduce demand that could on the acute system. Obviously, good health services have positive impacts on the NHS as well, on personal social services as well. Sorry, JL, I pressed the wrong button. That's it. Just to depict the system of long-term care, I'm sorry this is detailed, and as always, people say with these sorts of multiple slides, it's not so much the detail, but the existence of the detail that is important. The box in the middle is social care, and as you'll see, it's shown here by the National Audit Office as being part of a system that comprises health, housing, leisure and well-being, welfare and benefits. There are also dependencies between between social care and other services, such as, for example, the criminal justice system. The point is that policies in social care obviously depend upon resources and activities in those other parts of the system, and similarly those other parts of the system depend upon the level of resources that are available to social care. So when we talk about the impact of social care, we're thinking about its impact in the context of a pretty complicated system of interdependencies that frankly we don't map and don't really understand in a systematic way. Policy. So what is the policy that the last government pursued? We're a coalition government, and one of the sort of first steps of setting up our first coalition government for 50 odd years was that it set out a programme, and there are a number of parts of that programme that relate to social care and to older people, and I want to concentrate particularly on older people because they're the biggest users of health and social care by far, and of course that's where increasing demands are being experienced, both in terms of the numbers of older people and also the complexity of their needs as patterns of comorbidity arise. And like all good political statements, it's pretty high on sort of values. In terms of the care system, it talked about the new government's commitment to be treated with dignity and respect, reforming the system of social care to provide more control to individuals and their carers, and easing the cost burden that they and their families face. They were going to help older people to live at home for longer through home adaptations and community support programs as examples. No real detail. We're going to guarantee that health spending increases in real terms in each year of the Parliament, and it believes again in dignity and respect in old age, and older people should be provided with the support they need, and so their pensions were going to be absolutely guaranteed. This coalition was launched in the Rose Garden of 10 Downing Street. You might feel that sort of language has some, reflects the kind of notion of the roses round the door of the country cottage and things like that. These are some of the specific policy priorities. So along with everything that was said in the coalition agreement, over the last 5 years there's been a new duty to promote well-being, to assess the needs of self-funders and provide advice, so some significant additional responsibilities. A higher priority to integration with the NHS, partly to enable it to close the 20 billion gap, budget gap that was identified in the last Parliament, and there's a further 20 billion gap identified in the coming Parliament. And indeed, the social care's work with the NHS was said to be absolutely essential to sustaining the NHS and its values, its core values, in the way in which we've come to know and love it. And Nigel Lawson, a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, once described the NHS as the closest that we have to a national religion, given our sort of national church, the Church of England, which will always seem to be on the fairly sort of cautious side of enthusiasm. Actually, the way in which we regard the NHS, as anybody who lived through the last election campaign will testify to our visitors, is something quite incredible. It is almost unchallengeable, and there is an assumption that whatever we do in this age of austerity, we must protect the NHS. So, I came across this recently, the Joe Biden test. I thought he was quite useful. Maybe that there are some of you here who know it. You know, he's the current vice president. So, you know, I've explained that we've got a lot of nice, high-sounding value statements, and he says, don't tell me what you value, show me a budget, I'll tell you what you don't value. So, perhaps we should take him at his advice and have a look. This is spending on adult social care. What I will show you is the next one, which shows spending on adult social care since 2005-06 down to 2012-13. The most recent year for which we have figures is 2013-14, and the trend downwards continues. Just want to say two important things about this, apart from the fact that it suggests that we haven't in fact been as successfully putting some of those values into practice as one might have hoped. First is that this shows expenditure both in real terms, but it also shows it, the standardised line shows it when we take into account changes in population and other factors that affect the level of demand for social care. And so, first of all, the bottom line on there, the red line there, shows us that spending, when you take into account those changes in demand as well as changes in inflation, that it has fallen quite significantly from 8 to 6 billion, just under 6 billion. Now, that, as Jose Luis said, is really significant historically. Under the Thatcher government, there was a commitment to maintain spending on social services by 2% a year in real terms, in recognition of the fact that the population was ageing, the NHS was reducing the use of hospitals, and there were other sorts of factors which meant that just to stand still to maintain service cover, personal social services needed an increase in spending every year. So, and the very first year of the Thatcher government produced a reduction, an absolute reduction in spending the first time it happened. And actually, really interestingly, the NHS got very, very upset about it. And the presidents of rural colleges went up to see the Prime Minister and said, you can't do this, you know, our services depend on the funding in social care. And so the policy was actually revised, and throughout that government, there was at least 2% a year growth. So that represents a very substantial change historically. Secondly, and also it's a change which began with the introduction, with, you know, we can say the beginning of austerity around 7, 8, 8, 9, but it has decreased really rapidly over the last 5 years. The second thing is that there's a couple of lines here that are called non-client income. What that means is on top of the spending that local government puts into social care using central government grants and its limited powers to raise money, on top of that, it also receives transfer payments from the NHS to help it support some of the its activities. And that amounted to, last year, about 800 and I think about 860 million. It's going to be more this year. But even with those transfers, as you will see, it wasn't enough to maintain expenditure in real terms, given the change in the levels of need and demand. So, that's spending. Just quickly to look at what this has meant for services and people receiving services. And as you'll see, the proportion of adults aged 65 plus receiving services has again gone down, mirroring that spending, and it's gone down from over 10% to just about 6%. The two colours show the split. The brown is residential and nursing care, home care, and the blue are community services. and that shows the same data in a slightly different way. As you'll see, the bulk of the reduction in activities, in services, comes providing support for people in their own homes, notwithstanding the policy of enabling people to live in their own homes. Again, that's not new. You can take this back into the 80s and you can see that there's been a switch between that despite in the late 80s, the Community Care Act was set up new funding arrangements designed to change the balance of spend in the reverse way, so that home care would grow more rapidly than residential care. We've actually seemingly failed to achieve that in times of plenty as well as in austerity. So this isn't just about austerity. So there's quite a lot of contradictions in those few figures, and I just want to conclude by trying to understand how those contradictions have emerged and what we might be looking for in the future. First of all, the full statement about the NHS spending, which I put up the full statement about NHS spending was not that which I put up on the previous slide. The final part of that quote is that the government recognised that its promise to maintain spending on the NHS, to increase it in real terms each year, would have an impact on other departments. So, in other words, in order to meet their overall fiscal targets and protect the NHS and to other services, one was the school spending, and the third was spending on international development. In order to meet those targets, cuts would have to fall proportionately heavier in other areas of service. And local government took a very big hit. Its spending overall was planned and did fall by 27% from 2010 to 2014-15. However, within that reduction in local government, during the last period of government, social care did receive some degree of protection, both in the sense that local authorities didn't cut social care as much as they cut some other services, and secondly, they received that 860 million transfer from the NHS, where it built up to 860 million a year. And that meant that social care, on average, had cuts per capita of 17% compared with 23% for local government as a whole. That's cuts of 17% over that period. Should mention that one of the other reasons why local government may receive cuts is it's actually not allowed to overspend, whereas the NHS may not be allowed to overspend, but it doesn't have a legal duty to set a balanced budget, and it's regularly bailed out during the year. The NHS overall increased by about 4% over the Parliament, but it also fell behind the demographic curve. So even by spending more on the NHS didn't keep up with the growth of the population. So how did local authorities respond to this reduction in resources? Well, as I've said, they tightened eligibility criteria. They continued to concentrate more care on fewer people. So if you had high levels of need, people did receive higher levels of support at home, but people with lower levels of need didn't receive care at all. And we calculated that I think was it $350,000 people left the system. Something like that, wasn't it? Yeah. They also have changed their contractual agreements. They are, for example, having trying to reduce costs through contracts, and in particular, there's been an increase in very short-term contracts for visits to older people, a lot of 15-minute visits. So real problems about the quality of care but although some services have been maintained, the quality of care is a problem. We had a big sort of warning shot across our bows about 2 years ago when one of the big private sector residential home providers went bankrupt, and that created real realization that the stability of the provider market was something that needed to be managed, and their financial circumstances, we needed to have better information about what they were so that we might be able to do some contingency planning. There's been a shift to private funding, and of course there's been a huge increase in demand for non-urgent care in the NHS through people going to A&E. Looking ahead, the picture I suggest is higher demand and fewer resources. The IFS, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, that's the equivalent of, I suppose, a religion in the financial statistical world. And it calculates there will be a further 20% reduction during this Parliament, which means a total of 40% spending taken out of local government over a 10-year period, without a reduction in their statutory responsibilities, and indeed an increase in some of them, which the study of added burden shows was not properly funded either. The most deprived local authorities are continuing to face bigger real-term cuts than the smaller ones. The ADSS examination, that's the Social Services Directors, calculated that in the year 15-16, £1 billion would have to be taken out of their, or are being taken out of their budgets. And as the National Audit Office has said, that we have a major problem, however, that we don't actually know what the impact of this change in spending is. A, because there are a lot of systemic interdependencies that are very poorly studied, and B, as Quality Watch says here, we don't gather the data anyway. So it's very difficult to demonstrate what the impact is, but in the long term, i.e. over the next 5 years, it is impossible, I think, to see a change in the pattern of deterioration in cover for older people and indeed other client groups.
Thank you very much. There's 30 seconds for clarification questions, otherwise we'll move on to the next presentation. Anyone?
From public health standards, so that you mentioned the preventative services that are worth really low anyway, and they're going to get cut by 200 million. So with any prevention that is there, will likely get worse. So just to sort of go into some context.
So I was just going to say that it's absolutely fascinating that having transferred public health responsibilities to local government, it allows the government to take money out of public health without technically cutting money on the NHS. It's just that local government buys a lot of their services from the NHS.
Thank you very much. And we're now going to move to the next presentation. David Bell comes from the University of Stirling in Scotland. David has been involved with all the major reforms, evaluation of the major reforms in Scotland, so we're really lucky to have him here.
My title, Austerity and Social Care and Scottish Experience, somewhat or slightly different from the experience in England, but not massively so. Let me start with, for those international guests, I'll explain a bit about Scotland, that people in the far north who live in perpetual sunlight at this time of year and perpetual darkness in winter. So we have broadly the same institutional arrangements for long-term care, social care, as in the rest of the UK. The key role, as in the rest of the UK, is played by local authorities. Service delivery through local authorities is either support for care homes, almost all of which are in the private sector, but people will be supported if they're unable to support themselves in terms of the costs, and care at home. So the set of providers that the Scottish Government will work with are from the private sector, the voluntary sector, and an increasingly small proportion provided by local authorities. Just as in the rest of the UK, local authorities in Scotland have very little financial independence because in relation to the Joe Biden test, they fail in that they raise only a relatively small proportion of their total budget. The Scottish Government's own funding comes almost entirely from the UK Government, although that may be changing. We may come back to that issue. The Scottish Government has control over almost all spending programmes in Scotland other than welfare. So it determines health funding, it determines how much is spent in the by local government. Obviously the UK government does the same for England. It's not the English government that does the same for England, but that's another debate that we probably won't get into. In Scotland and England, although they're both called the NHS, the way that they are organised is significantly different. And Scottish Government can set its own laws which might have implications for the NHS on the one hand and for local authorities on the other. Scotland's budget, as I said in the last slide, is determined by the UK government. It has experienced similar but not identical cuts to the UK as a whole. I'll do a little nerdy bit here. UK government spending is split into annually managed expenditure and departmental expenditure limits. Annually managed expenditure covers largely welfare and things like debt interest, which the government only manages on a year-to-year basis, and departmental expenditure limits, which covers the main government departments like health, education, and so on. And their funding is determined largely, not exclusively, by what are called spending reviews, and it's that part of government spending that is likely to be hit that we heard of in the last presentation. The cuts that have been set so far have been mainly on DEL, not exclusively. 12 billion is due to be cut out of welfare spending, which is annually managed expenditure, and the government at some time, goodness knows when, will actually reveal the details of that, of those new cuts which are heading into welfare. Scotland has, and this is entirely a coincidence, not Machiavellian planning by the Scots, we're often accused of that, but it has coincidentally experienced less severe cuts than the rest of the UK because its budget is more concentrated in the protected areas, which are health and schools. Overseas aid is obviously not, Scotland doesn't have an overseas aid budget. And because the UK government chose to protect spending on health, the Scotland's budget actually didn't get cut all that much. But the Scottish government, although it may claim to be very independent and think entirely in different ways from the Westminster government, decided to do exactly the same thing in respect of health spending. In other words, it protected within its own budget the health budget in broadly in real terms, although not adjusted for population. And this is actually where we are at the minute for the UK as a whole. The line at the top is the sum of the two bars underneath, and the first, the dark bar is departmental expenditure limits. The yellow bars are the annually managed expenditure. What you see happening is departmental expenditure limits falling as a share of overall government spending, and overall government spending falling to about 36% of GDP, which will be the lowest level since I think around the 1930s. That's taking us into a forecast period going up to 2019-20. Whether those figures will be exactly replicated, we don't know. It will depend on the government spending review in July, but the indications are that it's going to move to, well, there's no indication that that kind of evolution won't occur. So, how has Scotland done relative to the rest of the UK? And indeed, how have Wales and Northern Ireland done? If you compare their spend on health on the one hand and social protection on the other, social protection is welfare spending plus social care spending, so it's not just social care spending. What this shows, actually, if I can show you here. So, for example, this is England. That's health spending in 2008-9. Beside it is health spending in 2012-13. Beside that, social protection 2008-9, and then social protection 2012-13. The UK average is 100. England is always slightly underneath, but because it's so big, that allows everyone else to be somewhat above the UK average. And what you see happening with Scotland is that its spend on health here started at about 12% above the UK average, and by 12-13 was about 9% per head above the UK average. And similarly, its share of social protection spending has also been falling. Wales is an interesting case because its health spending is significantly less than Scotland's, but its social protection spending significantly greater, and social protection spending is more demand-driven because the welfare budget is coming through that particular mechanism. So partly explains why the Welsh feel very hard done by in terms of the funding settlement that they have. So the Celtic nations get more money per head, although in Scotland's case, its advantage has been declining. So Scotland has been cutting its spending on local government. So the local government spend is that spend within which social care takes place. And there's been a 10% real cut between 2009-10 and 2015-16. And as we've heard from the last presentation, further cuts are now expected. The red bars show health, which has been broadly constant in real terms over that period of time. The local authorities include the police and fire service, and we now have no longer local authorities being responsible for that. Another sort of trick, like the public health trick in England, where you take, in this case, responsibilities away from local government. So what are the sorts of consequences that we're seeing? Well, this is delayed discharges. One of the big issues in I guess, wherever. It's the interface between between social care and the health service, and it's those people who are the number of patients who are held in hospital because there's not a suitable accommodation for them in their community. And what we see happening, so this runs from 2001 through to 2015, that there was a very significant improvement during the first decade of this century. And that stalled and in fact has been slightly reversed because the resources for finding suitable settings for people in the community have become harder and harder to find because the funding isn't there to provide that kind of support. So what has been successful is the huge reduction in the numbers waiting more than 6 weeks to get out of hospital. Another area where Scotland differs from the rest of the UK in terms of the social care policies and the so-called policy of free personal care. So, following a Royal Commission for the UK as a whole, which argued that personal care should be made free to those who need it, kind of on the argument that it should be an extension of the NHS, free at the point of delivery. Scotland introduced free personal care in 2001, and that policy was not adopted in the rest of the UK. And in Scotland, those assessed as needing personal care were provided with care either in care homes or preferably in their own homes. So there's a massive attempt to shift the balance of care out of care homes and towards people in their own home. Charging for other forms of care continues for those aged under 65, so there's an age discrimination element to this, and there's also charges for non-personal care. Care charges determined as in the rest of the UK by some kind of means test, a threshold income, and then a tapered charge. Care homes were given fixed compensation for personal care costs, which hasn't been maintained in real terms. And that, again, Scotland has the same issue about the resilience of the care home sector, partly as a result of contracts from local authorities that have been pretty mean over the last few years. The cost of the policy itself, though, has gone up from 250 million to about 500 million over a period of 9 years. The net cost of the policy is kind of difficult to assess, partly because by looking after people in their own homes, even quite intensive packages of care can be delivered, which may effectively be quite a lot cheaper than having someone in hospital or indeed in a care home. So that switch from care home provision to cheaper care at home may be part of an overall cost analysis of the Scottish system that hasn't really been worked through. This explains, for example, how the local authorities, cash-strapped local authorities, have been pretty penny-pinching in terms of their willingness to support increases in personal care charges or personal care support to care homes. So over the period since the beginning of the policy, the weekly support charge for personal care has increased at just over 1%. Nursing care, which is less important but is also part of the package, has increased at about 1.4%. That's against a rate of inflation of 2.5% and a minimum wage increase over the same period of time of over 3.5%. So there has been a fairly penny-pinching approach to increasing personal care support. So one of the things that's happened in Scotland is that this support has gone in, mainly the increase has gone into supporting people receiving free personal care at home. The number of people in Scottish care homes has actually been falling. Against the demographic trend, the number there, that green line, is the number of long-stay care home residents aged 65 plus. It's dropped slightly. The supply hasn't been there, and there has been a consistent government policy to support people in their own homes. The number of people who are self-funding, the proportion of people who are self-funding within the care home sector has been increasing slowly, and these are the ones who are getting the free personal care support because they are eligible for the full care home charges. So they get some part, but not by any means all, of their care home charges met. And what we see happening is that local authorities become more and more concentrated on supplying personal care. So other forms of care get really almost minimal support now from local authorities, whereas back in 04-05, the total number of people receiving some form of care support was nearly 60,000, of whom about 35,000 were receiving personal care. The situation now that there are about 50,000 people receiving local authority support, but almost all of these are receiving personal care support. So we've seen that shift. So actually, all that this graph, it's one of these where the writing is too small. But what you want to take from it is that the left-hand graph is kind of the pie chart of the ways in which social care for adults aged 18 plus was divided into things like care homes, home care, daycare, and a thing we call self-directed support, which is people receiving cash and using that to buy their care. Between 2008-9 and 2013-14, which is the right-hand pie chart, the pattern hasn't changed all that much. There's been a big increase in self-directed support, but that's the main change that's happened over this period of time. So it's a bit of a juggernaut in the sense of trying to effect a very significant change in patterns of care provision is quite difficult. If you look at it in per head terms, the support in the 18 to 64-year-old group in real terms, which is a rectangle, the hollow rectangles here, has been gradually falling for the 65 plus group, which is this group, and for the 18 to 64-year-olds, it's been pretty static in the last few years. Some of this predates, the slowdown predates the financial crisis, actually. One of the things that happens in Scotland but is not well understood is that there are significant transfers from the NHS to local authorities, and that funds part of the social care services. So most of social care services spending comes from net revenue support from local authorities. This is running from 2008-9 to 2012-13. User charges make up around 9% of total support, but around 13% is a transfer from health boards to local authorities. The trouble with this is nobody really understands the basis on which these agreements are made and whether they are in any sense efficient or adequate. So they exist, they haven't changed very much. They run at around 13% of the total support is actually a transfer from health boards. And that's things like long-stay patients being moved out into care homes, and the local authority, the health board pays for that.
David, can I just
Yes.
ask?
The charges to service users, that's charges made on local authority commissioned services. It doesn't
Yeah.
include people who are wholly or partly self-buying privately.
No, it doesn't. It
So
doesn't.
It's charges for
It's
the
charges
local
for
authority services here.
local authority commission services. It's not necessarily provided by local authority, but yeah. So, just want. Yeah, only got 4 to go. Just want to raise another couple of points. So Scotland produced the Public Body Joint Working Act in 2014 with the following provisions. So the integration of health and social care has for a long time been an objective of the Scottish Government. Whether that will work efficiently or effectively is another issue, but legislation is now in place to try to ensure that that happens. So, health boards and local authorities are to be held jointly accountable for a set of outcomes, nationally agreed outcomes in relation to health and social care. There is to be a requirement for integrated health and social care budgets. This is a revolutionary. There's a requirement on these so-called partnerships to strengthen the role of the professionals from their respective areas to plan and deliver services. And these partnerships are to be jointly accountable to ministers, local authorities, and NHS boards for delivering the nationally agreed outcomes. So there's an effort, and at the moment plans are being put together whereby the delivery mechanisms of these jointly agreed outcomes are being put in place. Others are much more qualified than me to talk about the contrast that there might be with the English Health and Social Care Act 2012, but we can maybe discuss that later. Just my set of conclusions. One of the things that I hope I brought out is that this free personal care actually legislated on the provision of personal care to those aged over 65 in Scotland. What that's done is direct resource to where legislation forces local authorities to operate. And actually, if you look at the Family Resources Survey, which is common across the whole of the UK, you can see and put a few of these together and look at the number of people, or the people who are receiving support from local authorities. There's a significantly higher proportion of Scots aged 65 plus who are receiving local authority support. No difference for those aged under 65. So in that sense, legislation does seem to be having an effect. The Family Resources Survey also shows that in terms of informal care provision, there was no significant reduction in the number of informal care providers following the introduction of free personal care in Scotland. There is a debate about what carers do, and we're trying to do some work on that, whether they're at the kind of less the sort of what is sometimes described as the shopping and mopping end of care provision. We're trying to find out about that. In a sense, I think that the cuts have forced the agenda of integration between health and social care. We just don't know yet whether legislation alone will provide the answer, delivering at least as good outcomes more efficiently than the current system does. but to be fair to the Scottish Government, they have also put a lot of effort into that integration area through a thing called the Joint Improvement Team, whose job is entirely to facilitate better liaison between the health boards on the one, or health provision on the one hand and social care provision on the other. It's got its own website, which is quite interesting. And also, there was 300 million spent on what's called a change fund, which came out of this idea that prevention is better than firefighting. These sorts of funds are useful if they're properly evaluated. It's not at all clear that that's been the case. Just a couple of things to add that I haven't really talked about. Housing seems to me is something that we ought to be discussing in this context. It has played no part in the solution as far as Scotland. That's unfair, but it's only a minor part of the story up to now. And strangely, one of the effects of the cuts has been to increase the divide between income on the one hand and wealth on the other, because quantitative easing, which was used to bring the UK out of the recession, actually seems to have had a particular effect on asset prices, such as housing, which has increased the wealth of householders, so fewer of them get through asset tests, and had no effect on their income. In Scotland, and probably in the rest of the UK, the forecast is that there will be a substantial rise in the number of households in the next decade. Almost all of them single households, people aged over 65. So that issue I don't think has been addressed. Finally, whether will, and controversially, but very currently, will new tax powers for Scotland increase the resources into social care? I wouldn't count on it. So there we go.
So now we've got 20 minutes for questions and debates.
Sorry, all over. So Josh Muir, Orchard International in the United States. I was basically interested in the political debate about these cuts, whether there was any that was taking place, or what the arguments were, or whether this was all kind of behind the curtain and nobody really talked about it.
I mean, my immediate response to that is that it's largely been behind the political curtain, partly because the focus has been on other things. Any comparisons between Scotland and England in recent years hasn't gone into the detail of which areas the cuts have been. There is a widespread perception, which is probably quite fair, that Scotland does relatively well out of its current settlement, and the focus has been on that. The other issue, I think it seems to me, is that actually Scotland is pretty good at collecting statistics on the kinds of issues that you're talking about, but it's quite difficult to compare them with this. Just because the systems are different, it's quite difficult to come to anything but fairly broad conclusions about where the direction of travel has been in the last few years, and partly I think is that in Scotland we know very little about the private sector and private sector provision. I think the evidence in England is somewhat stronger, but it may well be the case that the private sector has a much lesser role in Scotland, but we don't really know that for certain, because the government is very good at collecting, the Scottish government is very good at collecting government statistics, but not so good at collecting things that go beyond its remit.
Gerald, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. One is that
in some respects, it's very surprising that the magnitude of the cuts in spending and activity in social care haven't attracted as much public recognition as you might expect it to, particularly given, as I've said, that they're at an unprecedented level, and they affect a lot of people. But it may be that they affect people who are less able to express their voice than other people in society. That's so I think that's an issue. However, in the last general election campaign, I was very interested to see the extent to which politicians referred to social care as being part of the package that goes with the health service, and that cuts in social care do have an impact on the extent to which the protection of the NHS makes sense. I mean, I think there is a growing understanding of that. It hasn't been well understood, and it isn't universally understood. The other point I would say is that we've made a different choice, or at least that's to say, because of our electoral system, just over a third of the population chose to elect a majority government that intends to reduce the deficit slightly more quickly than the other parties, but not that much more quickly, because there is a consensus around the need for austerity, and that has taken priority, it seems to me, over the understanding and reaction to cuts in particular services. What I don't think we really understand, despite what I've said about the general recognition of the interdependence of social care, is that the reduction of spend and activities in social care is a big part of the price that we pay for maintaining the health service that we have at the moment, and that is certainly a bigger priority politically, than a concern about the level of cuts in social care.
Caroline and Bert.
Thank you. Caroline Glendenning, retired from the University of York. I just wanted to make two comments rather than questions. The first is that, I mean, I absolutely agree with the comments that the way in which we're beginning to be aware of the cuts in social care is because of the impact on the NHS. However, I think there's a danger in just thinking about social care as something that is there to improve the efficiency of the NHS. I think that is a very narrow concept of social care, and very narrow concept of its potential in terms of enhancing quality of life. And so I would also make a plea for us to be thinking about the value of social care in terms of other kind of outcomes like social inclusion, well-being, citizenship, possibly even reducing inequalities. We may be pushed within the UK and England in particular into depicting social care because of its link to the NHS, but I don't think we should lose sight of the wider agenda, and I think it's important on us as academics to actually be promoting that wider concept and vision of social care. My second point relates to recognising, and both David and Gerald have alluded to the differences within, if you like, the populations of people receiving social care or needing social care, and in particular the different policy treatments of working age people and older people. And that is completely inconsistent. So in Scotland, working age people, disabled people still have to pay for personal care. They don't get free personal care. On the other hand, in England, the Dilmot report recommended that in terms of the care cap, people who come into or are eligible for social care at age 18 should not have to pay towards their care. So we've got complete inconsistencies between age groups and between countries within the UK. So it's just to sort of say, let's remember that long-term care may include different approaches and different policies for people of different ages.
Any reactions?
I completely agree with both of those points, actually. In relation to other outcomes, it does seem to me that, I guess it's part of the agenda for today, but a focus on social care just as a way of saving money for the NHS is to do it considerable injustice. And issues like well-being, and indeed, I think the impact of social care on carers is something that should be there on the agenda. The discrepancies across the UK. Scotland did take on the recommendations of what was a UK Royal Commission into long-term care in 1998, which recommended the policy that Scotland actually followed. There is clearly an age inconsistency within Scotland, and I know that the Scottish Government are looking into that, and it may be the case that it wouldn't be that expensive to deal with that issue, insofar as those aged under 65 that need personal care are probably not very affluent, and as a result are probably receiving care free at the moment. And therefore the amount of charges that local authorities are raising from this particular group is massively less than they could raise from those aged 65 and above. There's no question that, it is to me quite surprising that the Scottish Government hasn't been challenged in court for age discrimination for the current policy.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Caroline's point about not seeking to defend social care purely as the adjunct or sort of handmaiden of the NHS, which is a role that it sometimes gets itself trapped into. The case, it's interesting that the new legislation for social care does give local authorities a duty to promote well-being through their social care activities. They've, for 20 years, had a power of promoting economic and social well-being more generally. And it is quite interesting, isn't it, that the most radical, but not risk-free, innovation that has been put forward in recent years, some might say since 1948, is the transfer of funding under contract from the NHS to local governments in the Greater Manchester area, partly, but not exclusively, partly to impact upon the level of health inequalities and the social and economic determinants of health. Now, as I say, it's not risk-free, there's a lot of challenge around it, but it is quite fascinating that and this also is a broadening out of the NHS agenda in terms of at the rhetorical level, the chief executive of NHS England wanting to see much more activity in prevention as part of the way of delivering a sustainable NHS. So it isn't just about the efficiency and effectiveness of the way we use current resources, it's also, as we've kept saying for a very long time, about shifting the balance of investment. And although there is quite a lot of opposition to what's happening in Manchester, I personally find it extremely interesting that we have this very radical proposal to shift resources, create a unified budget, not just of health and social care, but of health and local government, and therefore an ability to direct resources more directly in a more uniform, more integrated way at the social determinants of health. Problem is, of course, that a lot of those determinants are outside the control of local government as well, so it may mitigate some of them, but it won't meet the full objectives. But I think that is another development of interest.
Bernard, you wanted to?
Bernard Casey. Yes, that's right. I'm proud to say for the first time I can say this. I'm glad somebody mentioned Manchester, because it was interesting listening to David and talking about public bodies joint working. and Manchester had not been mentioned earlier. So I wonder if both of you could say a little bit about the similarities and differences between what was going on in Scotland and what is proposed to go on in Manchester. The other question which I was actually interested in, because it is a graph which we see very often, is the move from institutional to domiciliary care, and everybody shows this graph and everybody nods and says this is a good thing, or this at least is what people seem to want. Do we actually know, in terms of efficiency, all things being equal, which is better than the other? And if we do try and measure which is better than the other, what are we using to measure better? Are we merely using the costs for keeping somebody alive, or are we talking about qualities of life and satisfaction? And if we are talking about satisfaction, whose satisfaction are we talking about? Are we talking about the satisfaction of the person being cared for, or the satisfaction of the person who might have had to have cared for them otherwise?
So it's partly the question is focusing on the community the right way about going to coping with the budget problem. You want some to react to that, or there might be other people, I think, that might have views on this.
Well, I guess I'm ready.
Okay. I'll just flag some work that the Economics of Social and Healthcare Research Unit is carrying out just precisely on that point. So perhaps we can talk about it later on the efficiency and the balance of care issue. There were some questions. Cristiano had one question that didn't be on yesterday.
Hi, Cristiano Dori from PSSRU. I have two questions on the role of the research world in times of austerity. This was a point that José Luis already raised in his introduction. So the first question is if there are main projects, research projects in Scotland and or in England assessing the impact of cuts of austerity on older people and families and so on. So if there are projects and if you are involved in it. This is the first question. The second question is, what is your research agenda for these times? Because it means what are the research projects, the kind of research projects you think we need to understand the impact of these austerity policies, and also it raised a number of problems concerning who can pay for this project, because quite often the public power is not really keen on funding this kind of assessment.
Do you want us to respond? Yeah. Well, really, two really interesting questions. I mean, comparative research, England and Scotland. There are some. There's a research programme at the moment evaluating the first 14 integration pioneers in England. And I'm part of the team, so declaration of interest, I've probably now really upset my funders. When we put together the proposal, we thought it would be quite useful to have a look at the comparison between the new Scottish legislation that was mentioned earlier and the approach taken by the pioneers, because one is about creating a single budget and a single process of accountability for the use of that budget. And the other is about kind of business as usual, trying to oil the wheels of interaction between organisations and enable them to work more effectively together, but within the existing pattern of separate legislative and financial accountabilities. So we thought it would be a useful comparison, and we didn't get anywhere with that proposal. And the reason that was given was that obviously Scotland is a devolved country, and it would not be appropriate to either be looking at what was happening in Scotland with English resources, or you know how the civil service works. I don't know what so that was what we were told. I think, what's the role? I'm going to sound a bit sort of twee now, I think, because I think the research role is in this as it is in so often is the case, which is to expose hypocrisy and wishful thinking, and we have a lot of both around, it seems to me.
In fact, if I could add to that, the Department of Health is actually funding a piece of work on this, so it will come out in a year. David, do you want to?
Well, I'm involved in one project which has just started, which is through the Centre for Population Change at Southampton, which is this thing that I referred to earlier around time use and how carers use their time, and how the provision of services from a local authority or from whatever source affects how carers use their time. So it's to get at the fact that most of the kind of social type surveys that we've got in the UK don't get under this particular issue, and it's just a question of whether you're a carer and how many hours of care you provide. That doesn't really give you sufficient fine grain to understand what demands may still be unmet as a result of care provision. I would say another thing in relation to a somewhat different issue that did result in a discussion in Washington a couple of months ago, and that is on the longitudinal surveys of aging, which are focused on the health and retirement survey in the US, but in England you've got the English longitudinal survey of aging. In Ireland you've got TILDA, I can't remember what that stands for. But there are a variety of these surveys now of the population aged 50 plus, and it's and comparative data across different parts of the world. There's a new gateway into a common resource which people can access on data. Our question was basically whether the samples in each country of these longitudinal surveys are big enough to be able to say something useful comparatively cross country. But it's an area that is of interest, and Axel Borsch-Suppan, who runs Share in Europe, is one of the people who's particularly interested in that, and it may in time provide a useful resource. And indeed, the group is open to the introduction of questions that might be harmonised across countries.
And ETSA has just introduced.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have said just quickly, because it bears on what you asked, Christiana. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation, an independent funding foundation, has an ongoing study of the effects of cuts on local government in England and Scotland. Can't remember if Wales is involved. On their website.
We've only got time for one question. I think Agnieszka, you wanted to.
Agnieszka Sowa, Center for Social and Economic Research, Warsaw. Thank you. Agnieszka Sowa, Center for Social and Economic Research in Warsaw. I have a question regarding Scotland. You showed that the provision of personal care, which has increased, has not had an impact on the volume of informal care provided within the family. What would you think are the reasons of that? I'm asking because in Poland we have extremely high levels of provision of informal care, and for example we tend to believe that provision of personal care higher provision of personal care would have a positive impact, for example, of labour market participation of females. Have you observed these sort of relations?
Well, I mean, this is partly why we're doing this time use study. It may be that someone is in need of personal care and is receiving local authority support for that personal care, but at the same time a relative, a daughter,
may still describe themselves as an informal carer because they are giving support around, they consider themselves part of the support team for that individual, and that may in fact enable them to participate in the labour market because the type of care that they are now providing is less demanding on their time. But the way the questions are asked in our surveys tends not to be able to pick out that particular issue, and that's one where what we're trying to do is both quantitative and qualitative interviews with carers in Scotland and England to pick out exactly what it is that people do and what is it that causes them to describe themselves as informal carers.
Thank you very much. We've now got half an hour of break, so there'll be plenty of time for further discussion. But before we do, let's just thank